buried in a shallow grave, still breathing. A cowboy pulled her out and gave her a name. The shovel hit something that wasn't rock. I felt it before I heard it, a different give in the earth, the handle jumping back up into my palms like the ground had flinched. I'd been digging to set a corner post on the north fence line, that stretch of hardpan where the soil turns to chalk about 18 inches down, and I'd been at it since first light and was good and irritated, and I almost kept going. But I didn't. I went to my knees and used my hands. The dirt up there on the caprock was dry clear to the center of the earth that summer. The hole I'd been digging threw up little puffs of dust every time the shovel bit. And what I pulled out from under 10 inches of that dust was a woman's arm. Just the arm at first, fingers curled, the wrist turned in, a sleeve the color of old blood. I kept digging. Couldn't have told you then why I didn't stop and ride for somebody. There wasn't anybody to ride for. The nearest town was Haskell, 11 miles east, and I was alone on 4,000 acres of nothing, and she didn't have 11 miles in her. She was breathing. That's the thing I come back to even now. There was breath. Not much, a shallow flutter like a moth caught against glass, but it was there when I put my hand to her mouth and held still and felt it against my palm. Her face, when I got to it, was gray-white and cut across the left cheekbone, dried blood making a dark line from her eye to her jaw. Her lips were cracked open. She'd been in that hole I don't know how long, but it was long enough that the heat had started to cook her, and she still hadn't stopped breathing. I got my arms under her and stood. Carry a woman out of her own grave, that's not a thing you plan for, and there's no good way to do it. She was small, but she weighed more than I expected, the dead weight of a body that couldn't help itself, and it was a quarter mile back to the house. I remember the sun was straight overhead by then. The shadow I threw was almost nothing at all. My name is Cal Briggs. I was 53 that summer, which is not old but not young either, and I had been alone on that place for going on 9 years. My wife Dora died in the winter of '81, fever, quick. We had no children that lived past their first year, so it was me and 4,000 acres of dry grass and whatever the cattle market felt like doing, and most years that was enough. You get used to a life. You stop expecting it to be different than it is. I had a spare room. I laid her there on the narrow bed Dora's sister had slept in the one time she ever came to visit, and I built the fire up even though it was July because she was shaking. I washed the cut on her face with clean water and a cloth. I dripped water on her lips from a soaked rag, slow, and watched her throat move when she swallowed. Then I sat in the chair by the window and waited. She came around 3 times that first day and went back under each time. The third time she opened her eyes and looked at me straight, and I said, "You're safe. You're in a house. You're going to be all right." She didn't say anything, but she looked at me a long time before she went under again, and there was something in that look that wasn't fear. By the second morning, she could hold a cup. I made broth from what I had, which wasn't much: dried salt beef, a few root vegetables, half a sack of dried beans, and I sat with her while she drank it because the cup shook in her hands. She was young, 25, maybe a little more. Brown hair, dark eyes, cheekbones sharp in a way that was partly how she was made and partly starvation. She had calluses on her palms that told me she wasn't a town woman. She had a bruise around her left wrist in a band, like a rope. She asked me where she was. I told her. She asked if anyone else was here. I said no, just me. She seemed to think about that. Then she asked, "What are you going to do with me?" I said, "Feed you, until you can ride." That was all. She lay back. After a while she said, "My name is Clara," and I thought maybe that was true and maybe it wasn't, and it didn't matter either way. I want to tell this part plain, because it's the part that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't sat with a person pulling themselves back from the edge of dying. She got better. Not fast. The cut got infected on the 3rd day, and I had to open it and clean it again, and she bit down on a piece of leather and didn't make a sound. She slept 12, 14 hours at a stretch. She ate everything I put in front of her and asked for more, and I gave her more. I started setting an extra place at the table around day 5 because it felt strange to eat alone with someone in the house. And the first time she came to the table under her own power and sat down across from me, she looked at the 2 plates and the 2 cups, and something moved across her face that she put away quick. She didn't talk about who had put her in that hole. I didn't ask. What she did talk about, slow over days, was ordinary things. She knew cattle. She knew horses, real horsework, not just sitting. And she told me how her father had run a small operation in the hill country until it went under. She knew how to cook better than I did, and she started doing it, quiet, while I was out working, and I'd come in at dusk and the smell of something actual would hit me at the door. She asked me once about the north fence line, why I was running it where I was running it, and I told her about the water rights and the survey dispute, and she listened like it mattered to her, which nobody had done in a long time. One evening she asked me how Dora had died. I told her. She was quiet. Then she said she was sorry, and the way she said it, plain, not performed, I believed her. 2 weeks out from the day I found her, I saddled the roan for her and she rode the fence line with me. She sat a horse like she'd grown up on one, easy and balanced, and she knew what she was looking for when I told her what to look for. The Caprock country is mean in summer, treeless, just grass and limestone and heat shimmering off the rock, and most people find it ugly. She didn't. She looked out over it like she was reading something written there. She said, "You work this alone." I said, "Yes." She said, 4,000 acres. I said, "Near enough." She said, "That's too much for one man." I didn't answer that because it was true, and I knew it was true, and I'd known it for 9 years, and there wasn't anything to be done about it. We rode back in silence. The sun was low, throwing the shadows out long, and the cattle had drifted down to the creek, and the whole place looked almost good in that light, the way it sometimes did right at the end of the day. I unsaddled, and she did the same, and we put the horses up together, and she worked around me in that small space like we'd been doing it for years. No bumping, no asking where things went. I want to say something about what those weeks were, what they added up to. I am not a man who complains. My father didn't and his father didn't, and it wasn't something I was raised to. I had built that ranch up from bare ground in the middle of nowhere, and I had kept it through the dry years and the bad market years, and the year the river jumped its banks and drowned 40 head in one night. I had buried a wife and children that didn't live and kept going. I was not looking for anything. I had stopped looking. But there is a particular tiredness that comes from being a person that no one needs. Not loneliness exactly. I knew loneliness, and it was a different thing. This was the tiredness of doing work that mattered and having none of it witnessed, none of it acknowledged, none of it aimed at anything but the maintenance of your own survival. Like pulling a loaded wagon up a hill every day of your life with no one waiting at the top. I didn't know I was tired that way until she came to the table. Until she asked about the water rights. Until she rode beside me and said, "That's too much for one man." She came to me on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks in. I was at the table working on the books, which was never my best skill and always left me in a foul mood. The lamp was going, and I had my reading glasses on, which I hated, and I heard her come in from the back, but I didn't look up because the column I was on wasn't going to balance itself. She set a cup of coffee down next to my elbow. I said thank you without looking up. She didn't move. I looked up. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not defensive, more like she was holding herself still on purpose. She was looking at me in a way I hadn't seen a person look at me in a long time, like she was seeing something specific, something she had decided on. She said, "I know you're not going to ask me to stay." I didn't say anything. She said, "I know the kind of man you are. You'll get me fit to ride, and you'll put me on a horse, and you'll tell me to go to Haskell, and you'll mean it as kindness." I took my glasses off. I set them on the table. She said, "I'm asking you to let me stay." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I have been in the hands of men who thought I was something to be used and thrown away. And you pulled me out of the ground. And in 3 weeks you have not once made me feel like less than a person." She stopped. Then she said, quieter, "And I am useful here. You know I am." I said, "I'm 53 years old." She said, "I know how old you are." I said, "I am not an easy man." She said, "I'm not an easy woman." I sat there for a moment. The lamp was throwing yellow light, and outside the wind had come up off the plain the way it did at night, pressing at the windows. I said, "What's your name, your real one?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara is the name I want. I want you to know that. I didn't have a good thing to bring it to before." I thought about that. I thought about a woman choosing a name when she had something worth giving it to. I said, "All right." She came and sat down across from me. She picked up the ledger and looked at the column I'd been on and said, "You're carrying the Delaney pasture as part of the north section, but it's a different rate. That's why it doesn't balance." I looked. She was right. The next morning I showed her where everything was. The tack room, the medicine box for the cattle, the storm cellar, and where the key hung. The things that mattered. She walked beside me and asked the right questions, and I answered them. At the end, she said, "I'll earn my place here." I said, "You already did." She looked at me when I said that, not like she needed to hear it, more like she had already decided it was true, and she was just glad I knew it too. She put her hand on my arm, not soft, not careful, a grip. A woman who had just staked a claim. We stood there in the yard with the morning light coming slant across the grass, and the cattle moving out to pasture, and the windmill turning in the south breeze. My land. 4,000 acres I had built and held and nearly worn myself to nothing on. And it looked different with her standing in it. Not smaller, bigger. Like it finally had the size it always was. I put her name on the deed that winter. The man at the county seat looked at me over his glasses, and I looked back at him until he stopped looking. The ride home was cold. The blue norther had come through, and the grass was flat and silver with frost, and Clara rode beside me wrapped in Dora's old coat, which fit her different than it fit Dora, but it fit, and neither of us said much. About a mile from the house, she said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because this place is yours too. You work it. You saved it near as I can figure, the books, the fence plan, that whole business with the Delaney water last fall. You earned it more honestly than half the deeds in this county." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Nobody has ever trusted me with something that big." I said, "Well." Just the one word, she knew what I meant. We rode in. I put the horses up and she went in and got the fire going, and when I came in from the barn, the smell of coffee and something in the oven was already filling the house. And I stood in the doorway a moment with the cold at my back and the warmth in front of me and let myself have it, the plainness of it, the weight of it, before I took my hat off and went in. She was at the stove. She turned and looked at me across the room with those dark eyes, and she smiled, small and real, a smile that wasn't a performance. That was all. But that was everything. Outside, the norther pressed at the windows, and the grass lay flat and silver under the endless sky, and this was my place, and she was in it, and we had work to do.